Good afternoon, and welcome to Tea Time with the Jackson Center. I am Kristan McMahon, the president of the Robert H. Jackson Center in Jamestown, New York. Today's tea is sponsored by the Jamestown Bar Association. Justice Jackson was a distinguished member of the JBA, which continues to protect and promote the professional interests of its members, foster pride in the profession, and encourage civility and collegiality in the practice of law. Our guest for tea today is Professor Jon Hanson, the Allen A. Stone Professor of Law and the Faculty Director of the Systemic Justice Project, and the Director of the Project on Law and Mind Sciences at Harvard Law School. Jon, thank you for joining us for tea today.
It's my pleasure. Thank you for having me, and I hope you don't mind that I'm drinking iced coffee.
I do not mind. The tea is more of the time of day as opposed to the actual beverage. So
That's
yes,
what I
you
was
are
guessing.
welcome to drink whatever you like.
Great.
So, I feel as if there is a level setting place that we should start, but it's also probably the hardest question I ask you. And that is, how do we define justice?
Yeah, that is the hardest question, and we could spend our entire time on that and still just be getting warmed up. So I will tell you that I've spent the last 6 or 7 years struggling with that question, how to define justice. I've done a lot of it with a collaborator of mine named Jacob Lipton, who co-directs the Systemic Justice Project with me, and we teach courses on systemic justice. And so we really have an obligation to be able to answer that question, and it's tough. And I would add that justice as a term is kind of notoriously undefined. Justice Holmes wrote about in a letter to a friend how he hates justice because it has so little meaning compared to just what law stands for. And yet also justice, we know, in our system, in our culture, and in our legal system, and particularly the judiciary, is a, if not the most important kind of norm that we appeal to when we're talking about what we're doing. So all of this is just to say, you're right, Kristan, you've asked a difficult question, and I'm obviously just stalling. My efforts to define it with Jacob have had a number of sort of stages. So one part is just to look, does anyone have a definition that around which there is meaningful consensus? Can you look it up somewhere and find out what it is? And the answer is no. But in 2018, Merriam-Webster defined a name justice as their word of the year because clearly it's important. We look it up a lot, and we don't find a definition when we go to Merriam-Webster's that's anything other than tautological. So with that, we began reading philosophers and journalists and historians, and really trying to get a sense of what is it that people mean when they speak of injustice. And we think we've kind of made some progress on that front. But the easiest way to sort of appreciate that is to abandon justice as the goal in terms of what we're trying to define, and to understand that there is often much more consensus around injustice, what counts as injustice, and what are the set of perceptions that we have when we name something an injustice. And it turns out that, historians will point back to moments in history, and those moments will be perceived kind of universally at the time by today, by posterity today. We'll look back and say that was unjust, or in a given culture, at a given moment, the critical mass, the majority of people will look and perceive something as unjust, and journalists will give accounts of that. Or as philosophers study the question, they will often speak of injustice. And what we think we've identified is a set of three basic perceptions that people have when they feel injustice. And I'll stop after just naming these, though there's so much more to say. One is a perception of power being exercised to produce inequality or harm or suffering. A kind of harm or suffering that advantages those with power and using the power, and disadvantages those who are recipients of it, and that is done without legitimacy. So if you were to try to distill this into some mathematical equation, it would be something like injustice equals power plus inequality minus legitimacy. That's a working definition of injustice, and then from there you can begin to understand what justice means. That an institution like the judiciary or the law that purports to advance justice is in part claiming to respond to perceived injustices, to say that if that's illegitimate use of power to generate harm or suffering, then we will step in and right that somehow. We'll provide for compensation, or we'll do something to alter the relationship such that the power dynamic changes, or we'll punish someone who we think had enough of a bad intent or kind of malign motive in producing that injustice.
There is so much to unpack there. And I reached out to you initially to set up this conversation. I had told you that I had been reading an article about someone who had called the Department of Justice to ask what is the definition of justice under which they're operating. And it took some time for the Department of Justice to get back to the author of that article, but the answer came back really that they did not have a definition of justice under which that the Department of Justice operates. And I think that might come as a surprise, but also given the complexity of what you just laid out for us, maybe not. Maybe because the definition of justice is something that is situation or occasion specific. And so it's hard to have a global definition.
I think that's very right. So a couple of things. If you look at that strange tension between proclaiming justice, as your goal, or even putting it in your name, you'll see that throughout the legal system. That courthouses place statues and quotations on in and around their buildings, really celebrating this notion of what they're doing as being about justice. That the legal profession itself, if you look at the ABA website and other main sources of sort of professional organization, you'll see appeals to and claims of justice as being absolutely fundamental. In legal education, a great number, I can't say a majority because I haven't looked, but it feels like at least a substantial minority of law schools in their mission statements place the sort of advancement of justice as the or one of the top three things that they consider their mission. So it's always there, and yet also in all of those contexts, if you ask people, they don't have an answer. In fact, there's a lot of kind of famous stories of law students going to law school. And it was true when I was a law student way back, that if you raised questions of justice, it was almost silly. You were almost revealed as naive for believing that there would be an answer to that question. What does this have to do with justice? Might be the comeback of the professor at the time. So there is then this kind of what feels like a tension or even a hypocrisy about our attitudes to justice. But your point, in part because justice is less something that has a clear definition, that then we can identify it the way we might define a bridge, and then be able to point to a bridge and say that is one, and more of a felt sense. It's something we experience, and it's often, social psychologists tell us, it's often very much connected with the emotion of anger, such that even in circumstances where we're angry for another reason, we drove into work and every light caught us on the way, and it's just one of those days, and you get in and you're angry and you're having an interaction with a colleague, you're more likely, say social psychologists in those circumstances, to perceive those interactions to really suggest some disrespect, to be slighted, to actually perceive something like injustice, that's something wrong about that interaction only because you've got anger. So this this feeling that comes with injustice is really remarkable. It's also what makes us say when something is unjust, oh, let's get up off the couch. Like, I will stand up to injustice. It's a special feeling that actually mobilizes and catalyzes us to do something in response and to actually put ourselves second or third oftentimes, and to put a group or a victim ahead of ourselves. So it's a remarkable feeling. And then finally, to your point, what's activating that? Well, it's this set of criteria, each of which is subject to perception, to perspective, to context. And so in most cases, someone's argument that, A is unjust and therefore we should enact policy B, someone else will say, policy B is unjust and therefore we should stick with A. It's this in almost every major policy debate you can encounter. You can often distill it to different claims that are in some ways based on this rough definition of justice, where perspective on the matter changes whether someone feels self-righteous about saying, change it, and or whether someone else feels self-righteous about saying, keep it and don't change it.
Well, and I think that is often borne out in our laws as well, which, and perhaps this is more about unintended consequences, is that someone thinks that they have crafted a law that will have this intended set of results, and yet oftentimes inadvertently or unintentionally something else is impacted that had not even been part of the consideration. And so it can, and that isn't even necessarily close in time. It could be many years down the road as the understanding of those laws change. And so it's also something that we need to continuously be looking at, which in addition to a definition that is hard to nail down, those circumstances make it even more challenging.
That's right. Well, the very simple example of what feels like an injustice is where we see some individual making a very conscious and deliberate decision to harm someone else. And that individual that's doing it isn't otherwise carrying the legitimacy that would make us feel okay about it. So it might be in a circumstance where, someone is led off from the courtroom to a prison. We see that as very much a clear harm, but in some circumstances, that is legitimate. That's a legitimate use of force. Or where we see one competitor out competing another competitor in a market economy, we definitely see that patent or that innovation has given someone an advantage and it helps, but that is legitimate. Or where we see someone deciding, I'm going to take you up in a plane and allow you to drop off with a parachute, and the parachute doesn't work. We see consent as something that legitimates the inequality or the harm that's created through that relationship. So that all of this is mediated by these elements of whether there's legitimacy or not. And the simple story of someone, accosting someone else, harming them without justification is where perceived injustice emerges. And that's often where, there is escalation of violence between individuals or groups that may be implicated in that situation. On the baseball field, when that happens, at least when we were playing baseball with more players and so forth, the benches would unload and the bullpen runs in, and really, if you were to distill what they're saying, that throwing that ball inside and high for the third time in the same at bat, that was unjust. It was an unjust, it was using your power as a pitcher to potentially inflict suffering on the part of our player without legitimacy. So those are the easy cases, and those easy cases in some ways preoccupy aspects of the legal system. Intentional torts are an example where we see it really easily, and we're more punitive in our damages, and we're more demanding in terms of what we require someone who engages in that kind of behavior to compensate. And similarly, criminal law itself is a manifestation of this is the kind of deliberate, intentional action that creates harm that we are especially attentive to. The problem is that so many of our social problems are the consequence not of malignant actors who are intentionally trying to harm someone, but instead are built into the design of our systems, usually not consciously, in a way that is definitely harming some groups and helping others. And it is the way in some ways that the human mind works. It's the way in which those systems are often characterized and justified that makes people comfortable with that. That is, to feel it's legitimate. And one of the places where you often get tension between groups is in that space between one group that is feeling more or less victimized by that more complex system on one hand, and another group that's saying, you know, we didn't do anything intentionally. There's no injustice here. This is just the way the system works. And the tension emerges as that really you have two different perspectives on what's happening with and what's causing the same harm. I might agree there's an inequality, but that inequality isn't a consequence of us doing anything. And typically the argument is, if you're suffering from the inequality in a system, that's on you. In U.S. culture, in our legal system, we're very individualistic in terms of assigning responsibility and blame, and that more or less means the presumption in our legal system is if you're disadvantaged or suffering, then otherwise system where no one individually has deliberately hurt you, that's more or less on you. Well, if it's on you, then you are responsible for it, and there is no injustice. So I'm giving you long answers to your short questions. I just want to say I'm a victim of the topic. It is a complex topic.
Well, and I think that we're in a lot of that play out now, and this gets us a little bit into the conversation of systemic justice. I'm going to put a pause in for one moment, because I would also have a hypothesis that no one expected justice and baseball necessarily to be included in the same sentence. But I wanted to backtrack a little bit to when you were
You're
talking
obviously
about
not a
justice.
baseball fan, Kristan. Sorry.
I am a baseball fan, but perhaps I am more of a day kind of fan as opposed to deeply involved in it. But I wanted to take a step back to when you were talking about criminal justice, because that is, I think, most often where we think of the term justice coming into play. And in relationship to justice there, it's also that there is typically some sort of punishment or compensation that is attached to that. And I just was curious with regard to the research that you've done, and certainly the work within systemic justice projects, has that been shown to be effective? Do the punishments and or compensations really seem to impact justice?
And part of what I hear in your question is very much justice related. And part of what I might have heard was, is it serving a deterrence function? And I just want to make sure I'm clear on what you're asking.
I think let's keep it within the justice realm. And maybe it's, let me recraft the sentence a little bit. So we had David Crane on recently, who was the chief prosecutor for the tribunal in Sierra Leone. And of what he discussed and described was a listening tour for the victims. And that for them, that was an important part of justice in their eyes. It wasn't necessarily that they needed someone to be punished, but they really needed to tell their story. And so I wonder, how do we make room for the victim's concept of justice, or do we currently make room for that?
Yeah, I think that's great question. And I'm not going to claim to have a lot of expertise on this. And if I suggested I had expertise on these other things, my apologies. But I would say that I think when we think about what makes something unjust in terms of the felt sense of injustice, often it is that built into the relationship, power generating harm without legitimacy, really is a sense of human disrespect or disrespect across groups, such that you or someone or some entity or some system produced an advantage and a disadvantage in a way that suggested that there was a fundamental inequality between the people involved, that there was something inherently different about them that might justify the result, not something that otherwise justified it. If you look back in history, one of the common ways in which we have justified what we now see in history as injustice is by doing just that, saying we, the advantaged, deserve our advantage because we are of a special quality or of a special character or have a special disposition or maybe have a special culture that and that we deserve because of that or because of our relationship with some divine power to impose that on others, and they who have less or are being displaced in our expansion um, deserve that because they are less, and that set of justifications turns out is still with us. You can find it in many forms in justifying inequality today. In fact, one argument to go back to the criminal law system is that criminals became a label that we used to substitute for what had been a different label prior to the mid 20th century, when that different label was no longer itself legitimate. We can't say you are a lesser species or that you're biologically or hereditarily inferior. That argument had lost all of its credibility and legitimacy and had been viewed as taboo by the mid 50s and 60s. So part of what we needed was a new justificatory or legitimating, sorry, I can't handle the words that I want to say, legitimating account of why this inequality that otherwise we perceive in different groups or that we want to impose on different groups can be justified. And one argument is that criminals and criminality is the notion, the conception that was developed, not necessarily consciously, but there was some consciousness in the development of the strategy, say many historians, to do just that. And that where we are now in some ways in talking about decarceration, defunding the police, abolition, Black Lives Matter is really a collection of responses to what that later 20th century kind of effort and policymaking strategy imposed, and that we're reckoning to some degree not just with slavery and hundreds of years of, say, white supremacist institutions, but the last 50 years in which a particular version was justified in a particular way. To the question, what about the role of voice or hearing victims? I think that same point of like, we need something in our relationships to give us a felt sense of equality is quite fundamental. And that what social psychologists tell us in the question of legitimacy, under what circumstances do we perceive that a system or a process or an outcome is legitimate? The answer is often one in which the party, including the disadvantaged party, has a meaningful voice, or at least has an opportunity to tell their story. And I think that's absolutely fundamental to any system that's well functioning, that voice, that the opportunity to be heard, and not simply a result is part of that process. I will, if you don't mind, I'd like to say a little bit more to say that the other thing that social psychologists tell us is that our desire for voice in creating legitimacy of systems is actually so strong that we can feel comfortable about outcomes even when the opportunity to speak to the matter could conceivably have had no impact on the outcome, but simply to have been able to tell the story or to voice an objection or an account of what happened. And I both can understand that, but also think that should make us troubled, because it may allow us to live with injustice that we would otherwise find unacceptable, simply because of the existence of voice. And the last thing I will say is that I think apologies in some way are really powerful for some of the same reasons. That the recognition of the party that was arguably the perpetrator or arguably advantaged by a certain policy or system, acknowledging that and recognizing that, in some ways committing not to repeat it, is critically important. Many people would observe that our system doesn't contain those elements adequately. That there's not that the adversarial process often pits parties against each other in a way that makes them unwilling to hear one another and unwilling to apologize to each other. And the emergence of negotiation and mediation and other forms of settling disputes, I think, is in part a manifestation of a desire to create some of those benefits that come from more meaningful communication between parties.
We spoke with Riaz Kanji last week about the McGirt decision, and we also dipped into the peacemaking courts that some of the Indian nations or tribes also have. And Riaz mentioned that some of the courts in Michigan have started to adopt some of the same principles from the peacemaker courts, and they do tend to focus around that sense of community and speaking, and less on the punitive side and more on the voice, and how can the community help this person move forward now that this has happened.
I think that's wonderful, and it's an important addition to a system that has real deficiencies in that area. If we can move in that direction, it seems to me significant. I would add, however, for the reasons I've already suggested, that can't be enough. That we kind of have to be more attentive than we are to the lasting inequalities that have been with us for a long time, and to actually make repair if we want there to be a perception of justice, or more importantly, if we want there to actually be justice. Because part of what we can do is to create a kind of false sense that we've gotten there because we've gotten something that feels like satisfaction or peace in the moment, or a real connection between people. But often what happens is that's not going to really address the underlying issues, and those underlying issues are ultimately going to still be with us. And I, at least, am of a view that the commitment of law to justice, its purported commitment to justice, must mean more than simply creating the perception of justice. That there is got to be something deeper that we have to be aspiring to in our yearning for this end. And there, I think it's to try to understand and to go back to the elements I suggested, to try to understand better what are the different dynamics of power. There's the obvious ones where we see, someone with a gun and or a baseball bat, to go back to my other example. But what about when the power is built into systems, or it's built into roles, or understanding the Me Too movement is in part an understanding of power dynamics that are not so obvious and visible. Perhaps now they're becoming more visible, but 40 years ago, 30 years ago, 20 years ago, those things were only becoming visible as real sources of power that we should be sensitive to in deciding, why is it that this party was harmed? To put that point another way, the legitimating role of something like consent has to be questioned if we know that what consent often means is not something that should have that much of a normative impact, that consent may be capitulation to power dynamics in a situation where you have really no meaningful choice or no real better choice. And that difficult sort of double, triple bind problem is one that makes the notion of consent less meaningful. Coming to understand that is key. And also, to go back to the elements of justice, our insensitivity to inequality, our willingness to build institutions that in some degree insulate us from acknowledging the extent of inequalities, particularly across groups, sort of identity groups that have been with us, since we've created them in our history. Those inequalities are always there, but in a way, we have systems that help us look away or legitimate them. And I really feel like a real allegiance to the end of justice requires that we be very self-examined and careful about scrutinizing each element of that sort of equation that I articulated earlier.
So there are two things that you just said that I want to pick up on quickly, and they're actually probably two separate questions, but I'm going to ask them together in case I forget. So the first question, or the first idea, was that sometimes just talking about this helps us feel as if justice has been done. And what that twigged for me was that, is it me talking with my friends about the situation that has been experienced, or the harm that I either felt had been perpetrated against me or that I had perpetrated against someone else? Is that, from a social or psychological perspective, enough for me to feel as if I might have achieved some level of justice, and therefore I stop working towards what the actual systemic problem is, or what the true root of the problem is? And so actually, I'm going to change my mind and pause there after that question.
That's a great question, and I'm really speculating here, more than before, Kristan. And I would say the question regarding the helpfulness of speaking your story, of sharing your story about what happened, of telling what happened, might be understood as, within this larger context, that a lot of human interaction does lack objective definition or a single correct story. That part of what it means to be a human being is to have a perspective and a particular set of experiences that shape what happens, and shape how one understands what happened. And we rely on stories and categories and schemas and ideologies and, cultural norms and expectations. All of those things are shaping how we perceive a particular event. And that often what is happening in a contest over justice is really a contest over competing stories. And that when someone in power, say, exacts advantage with that power over someone else with legitimacy, and that person perceives it as illegitimate, what's really at stake is a competing story about whether it's legitimate or not. And that story is going to be whether the person let's call that person the perpetrator for just sake of clarity, the perpetrator tells a story that person chose it, consented to it, or deserved it, or whatever. And the other person tells a different story that says, I was a victim. I was I didn't do anything wrong and I had no option and so forth. So those kinds of competing stories, but we also see those stories being applied across groups. We have them in our culture to do with racial groups, with men and women, with adults and children. We have them, many of these are quite implicit, but they are there regarding people who are overweight, regarding people who have eating disorders, we even have stories and sort of stereotypes about age and on and on. Whatever you can kind of identify, and there's a lot of categories for identification, there are often a set of implicit stories that attach to that. The story that attaches to a harm that someone suffers or an advantage that someone else achieves is a story that is usually contestable. And an ability of a victim to be able to tell anyone their story is in some ways affirming to that person, because it allows that person to begin to retell what otherwise would be perceived as the existing dominant powerful story. And that telling a friend is going to certainly be a sense of relief, and a good friend is going to likely say, I totally hear you and I agree with you. Maybe a better friend would push back on some of the points and say, might want to rethink that. But that is not going to be fully satisfactory to a person who feels they've been wrongly victimized, that there's been an injustice. And that person is going to want and crave, understandably, to retell the story on the public space, because we're all also public. And because that story likely connects to a whole bunch of other decisions and allocations that our system sort of produces. And again, where we see movements in a society, we're often seeing a competition over those stories. And it's like Black Lives Matter. Black Lives Matter is a story. It's an account of inequalities that otherwise are being legitimated inappropriately or dismissed as trivial, or otherwise looked away from. So these stories are key. A legal system that responds by saying you will have a choice, you have an opportunity to tell your story, is in part responding to that felt need. In a legal system that says, we're going to allow two parties to tell their competing stories, and we're going to put a neutral party, say the jury from the public, to help mediate, to decide in a public way, like one story is right, and with the authority of the law, we're going to sign up to that one. And sometimes we're going to say that person was really bad and needs to be jailed, or that person needs to pay punitive damages. All of that is not just about damages. It's about the story and the quality of the story and the meaning of the story and so forth.
And that makes sense. And we talked a lot about systems regarding in relation to justice, and currently some of the topics that we're speaking about now: racial injustice or justice, environmental justice, social justice. These are all monumental systems, and it occurs to me that part of what has happened with the Black Lives Matter and Me Too movement is that the power structure, the power dynamic has shifted a bit. And so because those stories have always been there, or perhaps not always, certainly for a very long time have been there. But the power structure was such that either they weren't rising to the surface or they were deliberately dismissed. And now the power structure seems to have shifted to, perhaps sadly, and this may be an oversimplification, of there is such a critical mass of these stories that you can no longer ignore them.
Love that. I agree. And if you don't mind, I'll give one of my standard long answers that more or less repeats what you just said. Is that all right with you?
Yes, that sounds perfect. And then we'll move into questions from our audience too.
That's wonderful. Just to complicate it a bit, I would say that it's not just that the power dynamics have changed. one way to think of it is in terms of this, let's call it a triangle, of relationship between power, inequality or suffering, and legitimacy. And that if you think of it in that, think of those as really interacting, those three, and that it's interacting over time in history, you can see that there are moments that what's primarily changing is the power dynamic. But there are also moments when what's fundamentally changing is the story, the legitimating story. So I mentioned earlier, the middle of the 20th century was a time in which the stories that had justified inequalities really lost their credibility. And in part because they lost their credibility, it changed power dynamics. To be sure, power dynamics were also changing too. So if we think about the early 20th century, also we know that inequality was becoming more salient. If you just look at wealth and income inequality in the early 20th century, it was at very, very high levels, unlike anything else except today, where the stark wealth inequality was visible to all, and it raised a question, in a way, created a kind of dissonance between what people wanted to feel or tended to otherwise feel our system is just, and the very possibility that with these great inequalities that we can observe, and now we're observing them increasingly in the 20th century across wealth, but we're increasingly see them across ethnic groups, we're increasingly seeing them across men and women, and part of what's changing there is the war dynamic, as groups that were viewed as outside and other are often brought in to serve in the factories or to serve on the battlefields. They become more like us, and as they become more like us, it's harder to say they are other, and therefore we can justify the inequality based on their otherness, because suddenly they're becoming us. But so too are the legitimating stories. With the Depression, you could no longer say that inequality was about hard work and merit as much as it was historical accident, or arguably regulatory failings, or corporate power, or some other set of stories that leaves the inequality element without easy explanation. So you see the legitimating scripts changing, and then of course, as the Robert H. Jackson Center knows better than anyone, and your audience, Nazi Germany and the kinds of explanations that were used to justify the Holocaust in Germany, those justifications were coming from places like England and the US and other Western countries that had developed these ideological stories, justifications for inequality that had to do with heredity, genes, eugenics, and so forth. And those race sciences and that attempt to legitimate inequality had been thoroughly legitimated. And so we're coming out of the early 20th century with this quite unusual set of circumstances where the legitimacy of inequality was really questioned. The inequalities themselves were really particularly salient, and also power dynamics are particularly salient. And all of those things come together to a moment in which now suddenly you look at the same question and it looks totally different. You come to Brown v. Board and you're asking about whether separate is equal. No, and we're not really sure why, but we're going to use the word justice, and we don't have a lot of good precedent on our side, but it's a brilliant decision that we all look back at with some pride, that otherwise isn't coming from the law in some obvious way. There we begin to see law as something that has to have an allegiance to something greater. The Holocaust and the Nuremberg trials and so forth also taught us to some degree that lesson, that obedience to law was not enough to justify the existing systems. We have to have something higher that we're aiming for. So all I'm trying to emphasize is that there's nothing about power by itself that would change. Yes, power by itself changes the whole dynamic, but it's all three of those things that are operating. And if you're looking at history over time, you can almost watch and see inequalities of different times increasing and decreasing as you're watching these different dynamics between power, inequality, and legitimacy changing.
Interesting. And part of what you touched on there directly ties to our programming theme this year with the other. because these conversations were really hoping help people see how everyone is impacted by the same event differently based on their circumstances, based on their background, based on their own personal history, and to hopefully foster some empathy, if not agreement, to move forward into reducing the otherness of people who are unlike you. All right, we're going to move into some questions from our audience. The first one is from a Jackson Center summer intern, actually, David. And David's question is, in a class-based society, how can one attempt to alleviate minority versus majority conflict? And he's particularly noting, especially in our political system, the voice of the majority can directly oppose the will of the minority.
Yeah. David, it's a good question, and I will just say that it's been the question in attempts to create governments since the time governments were attempted to be created. It's been with us. We've never avoided it. That every form of government is somehow caught up in this question of what is the legitimating basis of our power. And sometimes it is something as simple as we have more guns or we have more arms than our opponents, you need to obey. But it turns out, in terms of group cohesion and solidarity and ability to work together, it's often very counterproductive for that group itself to be constrained only by explicit forms of coercion and power. And so systems have been developing over time to create ideologies and stories, and also to provide other means of legitimacy. Consent is something that comes out as a really important mechanism of legitimacy. It was something that Aristotle and others talked about, but it becomes really significant in the Enlightenment as the basis of providing legitimacy to a government, which is otherwise saying we now will give ourselves kind of monopoly power over a lot of major decisions that determine how people do. And consent then is a fundamental basis of legitimacy upon which our system is governed. The problem, of course, is that consent is hard to measure. And also consent is quite imperfect. And we knew that from the beginning, that consent has problems. If we all consented to a law that was clearly unjust, should that be the law, is part of the issue. And so you're constantly, unavoidably in this kind of insuperable problem. And what we see in our institutions is an attempt to minimize, trade off, and deal with those kinds of insuperable problems, so that we have separation of powers and balancing of power and checks and balances and different ways of trying to deal with, consent isn't always perfect. I know what we'll do. We'll create a judiciary. They will wear robes, they won't be elected, they will have life tenure, and they won't be subject to kind of the majoritarian difficulty. But as soon as you put them in, we've got the counter majoritarian difficulty. And to your question, David, then this means that the difference between classes is an example of, well, if it's majority rule every time, what we might end up with is inequality that is a reflection of a consent-based system, majority ruling system, that is producing inequality that continues to be unjust, nonetheless. And it does seem to me that really grappling with the question of justice is fundamental if we want to do much better at finding our way out of this difficult challenge. That means that when we see injustice across, or inequality across classes, we really have to engage the question, and maybe we have to build institutions that bring forward that engagement, that advance it, don't hide it, conceal it, minimize it. It goes to something we started with earlier. The opportunity to speak about these things is really key. But also, if we're going to purport to provide justice as a system, it seems to me that we have to be far more attentive to the real causes of inequalities across, say, classes.
Well, and that seems to me, and perhaps this is something the Systemic Justice Project deals with as well, and I certainly want to have you speak about that, but training ourselves to become aware of injustice within the systems, because many of us are very comfortable in those systems. And so trying to look for the injustices seems hard, certainly worthwhile doing. But how do we train ourselves to be aware of injustice?
Oh, Kristan, it's such a great question, and it's such
I'm gonna ask you to solve world peace
it's
next.
exactly. Yeah, no problem. I got this. It's a great question, and I'll take a stab, of course, at repeating your question in the form of an answer. The challenge of confronting the question of injustice is so great that social psychologists tell us time and time again, we have a desire to deny injustice, that we are inclined to perceive our worlds, our systems, our families, our groups as just. We're pretty good at seeing other systems, other worlds, other families as unjust or problematic in some sense, but we are very inclined to see our own as just. There's a famous social psychologist, Melvin Lerner, who devoted his career to that, and I think someone who is as equally as famous and will be more famous in his in terms of the impact and influence of his work, named John Jost, who's at NYU, who's just published a book summarizing 30 years of studying this question that he describes as system justification theory. And I recommend the book, not only because I read it and loved it, but because it speaks so well to your question, Kristan, about this problem that we are so inclined to believe our systems are just. And I think part of what we have to part of what we have to understand to respond to that is to understand that. That is, we have to build systems knowing that we are self-deceivers, knowing that we want to believe our systems, our way of living is just. We're real good at looking at history and other cultures and saying it is not just, but we need to get that good at least at seeing it with ourselves. And that takes practice, and that's something to do with education. That has something to do with culture, like what does a hero look like? What do our leaders look like? What does thoughtful reflection feel like? Those kinds of questions need to be answered in a way that encourages us to look at our own selves with a level of honesty that we're not inclined otherwise to do. And what Jacob and I also think that as we look at those particular questions while we're doing it, that could go a long way. That means digging in on what are the dynamics of power really? What are the various forms of and intersecting forms of inequality really? How really reliable are our justifications, our legitimating processes, our claims of consent in certain circumstances? If we built a real skepticism into ourselves in a culture and built it into our systems, we'd be better off. And one reason why I like tort law, by the way, is that tort law is a place in which we provide a venue for different parties to come tell their competing stories about what happened. That's a system that is really allowing for that. I think we live in a world in which we are so eager to have something that feels like harmony, what Martin Luther King Jr. called kind of a negative peace, a peace without justice, that we are unwilling to consider the possibility that we lack meaningful justice. And that just takes work, and it means slowing down, and it means, facing up to what might be a really ugly truth about our systems and ourselves. Can I take a little of the edge off of that? I think one daunting part of this is that the system is big and unchanged. We also need to understand the systems are actually much more manageable and regulable than we tend to assume, that they've changed dramatically, and understanding how they've changed in the past will help us understand how to change them. So part of it is make it seem a little less daunting of a project. And the other thing is that this has to do often with small advances in changes of stories, that that the Me Too movement is, as you described, a relatively new movement, but none of the problems were didn't exist before, and the Me Too movement isn't going to solve it, doesn't mean that the Me Too movement didn't have a real beneficial impact on the power dynamics between men and women in the workplace and in other places.
All right, we have a question from Helena, and she asks, how do we address the advent of conspiracy theories being placed on par with facts and intelligent discussion?
Well, it's really a challenge, and it goes to a couple of things that I've said. One is that it's a competition over stories. The very presence of conspiracy theories really is an example of how eager we are to have stories that affirm our view of the world. And we have to understand, in some ways, we're all developing a story, constructing a story, and preferring a story, all of which is not perfectly reliable, and has some flimsiness and confirmation bias at work within it. It's just recognizing that problem is a general one, recognizing that problem usually is one in which the allegiance to truth or self-examination is so weak that it feels absolutely ridiculous, and it feels really silly. The other thing to notice about conspiracy theories is that they're typically about taking what is a systemic problem and trying to translate it down to a particular set of individuals, often a group that we have historically and culturally already rendered vulnerable and disadvantaged and oppressed in some ways, and said that it's back on them, that's the source of the conspiracy. It's to put an evil intent where we actually see systems. And there's a lesson to be learned about ourselves in that same tendency. And then the obvious answer is to keep doing what I think many people are trying to do, is to try to meet conspiracy with better, more accurate, more contextualized stories that really do have some allegiance to truth and to the facts in a way that those don't. And to hope that once so much power in the hands of conspiracy theorists is relinquished, should that happen, we might begin to build institutions, including education systems, that are really building in us an understanding of our own histories, our own propensities, including to self-deceive, our own propensities to advantage some groups and disadvantage others. The more we do those things as a polity, as a democracy, as a people, the better we will be able to govern ourselves in a way that doesn't keep reproducing these same injustices.
Okay, last question, and it's one that I have been wondering with regard to the Systemic Justice Project. Do you notice a generational, I don't know if it's a disconnect or just difference in justice work? Are there things that the law students are particularly focused on that surprise you, or that seem to be different than what your peers or my peers might be focused on?
It's a great question, and the answer to that is absolutely yes. It's one of the things that I do each fall with my incoming first-year Harvard Law students is to poll them on what problems they consider to be most urgent, and where do they consider there to be injustice and so forth. And you can see that shifting over time. In the last 15 years or so, it's shifted between income, wealth inequality, climate change, criminal justice, criminal legal reform, mass incarceration, and so forth. So those things have definitely changed, and you see those changes across time, and those are almost predictable. As you come out of 2008, wealth inequality and financial crisis is going to be salient, and when we go back this year, we know that racial injustice will be salient. But what's really changed most dramatically is the intensity, the urgency, the level of commitment of students to those problems. And I would add connected to that, and it's something I think we should all be trying to listen to and wake up to, a very strong sense that existing systems, including the legal systems, are at best dubious, that they have problems, or at worst are designed, they're rigged in a way that is producing problems that advantage some groups and disadvantage others. There's no way a system can do well perceptions or those are the realities. And I think that's a key distinction that we're living through right now as we're kind of watching the news unfold, is a growing shared sense, particularly among that generation, but it's expanding, I'm sure, of the degree and importance of justice as a real policy goal in and of itself.
Well, thank you so much for joining me for tea today. And thank you also to the James Bar Association for sponsoring today's tea. Please join me next week when I will be speaking with Joshua Edmonds, the Director of Digital Inclusion for the City of Detroit, as we dive deeper into the conversation about technology and equity that we started with the Center for Democracy and Technology a couple of weeks ago. Jon, thank you very much for being with us. I actually wish we could keep talking, because especially that last point, I just want to drill down more on. So I hope at some point in the future, you will be our guest again.
I'd be delighted to. It was great, really nice meeting you, and really nice getting to talk about these things. And I'm going to tune in on next week. It sounds great.
Thank you much, Jon.